The coffee maker gurgled to life at 6:47 a.m., the same as it had every Tuesday for the past 24 years. I stood in our Cambridge kitchen, watching November rain streak down the window, and felt the weight of what was coming. "David?" Beth's voice drifted from the bedroom. "Did you see the email from my mother?" I had. 3 lines, formal as a court summons. Family dinner, Friday, 7:00 p.m. Important matter to discuss. "I saw it," I called back, measuring out the coffee grounds with the precision of ritual. The apartment was quiet except for the rain and the coffee maker's familiar rhythm. 800 square feet of comfortable chaos, books stacked on every surface, Beth's art supplies claiming the dining table, 24 years of shared life compressed into a space most people would call modest. Beth appeared in the doorway, already dressed for her morning class at the Cambridge Community Arts Center. At 49, she still had paint under her fingernails more often than not. She held her phone like it might explode. "When my mother uses the word important," she said quietly, "someone usually gets hurt." I poured 2 mugs of coffee, added cream to hers the way she liked it, and slid it across our scarred wooden counter. "Then we'll go prepared." "Prepared for what?" She wrapped both hands around the mug. "You know how they are, how they've always been." I knew. 24 years of polite contempt, of questions about my little consulting business, of Christmas gifts that were always just slightly too small, as if even their generosity couldn't quite stretch to include me properly. But what Beth didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that I'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Let me handle it," I said, kissing her forehead. "Trust me." She did trust me. That was the problem, and the blessing, and the secret that sat between us like a third presence in our small kitchen. An hour later, I drove my 2017 Honda Accord through Cambridge's morning traffic. The car ran perfectly well, despite what Beth's father thought, despite what everyone thought. I could have afforded something newer, something flashier, but that would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I parked 3 blocks from Patterson & Associates and walked through the rain. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated brownstone, the kind of place that whispered old money and older secrets. James Patterson stood when I entered his office. At 63, he still had the bearing of the Navy JAG officer he'd once been. He'd been my attorney for 27 years, since the day I walked in with an $800,000 inheritance and a crazy idea. "David," he gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, "I got your message. Is it time?" "Friday dinner with the Whitmores," I said. Beth's mother used the word important. James pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer. "I've been expecting this call for 5 years, maybe longer." He opened the folder, and I saw what I already knew by heart. Incorporation documents for Beacon Capital Partners, LLC, stock purchase records going back to 1997, dividend statements, proxy voting records. 27 years of careful, anonymous ownership. "Walk me through the current position," I said, even though I reviewed these numbers every quarter. James put on his reading glasses. "Whitmore Maritime and Logistics Corporation, 100 million shares outstanding. Beacon Capital Partners owns 44 million shares, or 44%. That makes you the largest shareholder. Current valuation. At yesterday's closing price of $340 per share, your position is worth approximately $14.96 billion. He said it matter-of-factly, the way another man might discuss the weather. I thought about the SEC I'd written that morning for our electricity bill, $93.42. Beth had asked if we should switch to the budget billing plan. "And the other shareholders?" I asked. "Richard Whitmore personally holds 19 million shares, 19%. Vincent Hayes, the CFO, holds 12 million shares, 12%. The remaining 25% is divided among institutional investors and employees." Vincent Hayes, Richard's friend for 30 years, his trusted CFO, the man who'd helped build Whitmore Maritime from a regional carrier into a major player in East Coast shipping. I'd been watching Vincent carefully for the past 18 months. "Tell me about Hayes' situation," I said. James's expression darkened. It's worse than we thought. He's been gambling. Online poker, sports betting. We estimate he's lost approximately $8 million over the past 2 years. And last month, he used his 12 million shares as collateral for a $50 million loan from Redstone Capital. Interest rate, 18%. Term, 90 days. I sat forward. Redstone? They're not in the business of patient lending. No, James agreed. They're in the business of asset seizure. The loan comes due next Monday. If Hayes can't pay, Redstone takes his 12%, and they have clauses that would give them first right of refusal on any other available shares. Which means they could potentially approach me as Beacon Capital. Exactly. They could try to consolidate control. And Redstone doesn't want to run a shipping company. They want to strip it and sell it for parts. I looked out James's window at the rain-soaked street. Somewhere across town, Richard Whitmore sat in his corner office at Whitmore Maritime, probably reviewing the quarterly reports, probably worrying about numbers that didn't quite add up the way they used to. He had no idea that his oldest friend had just endangered everything he'd built. And he definitely had no idea that his son-in-law, the one he barely acknowledged at family dinners, had been protecting that company for 27 years. Does Richard know about Hayes's gambling? I asked. No indication that he does. Hayes has been hiding it carefully, using offshore accounts, manipulating expense reports. He's desperate, David. Desperate men do desperate things. I stood and walked to the window. Below, people hurried through the rain, heads down, focused on their own small dramas. None of them knew that in a few days, at a dinner table in Wellesley, something was going to break open that had been building for nearly 3 decades. There's one more thing, James said carefully. We've been monitoring communications. 3 weeks ago, Richard and Catherine met with a divorce attorney. I turned back to face him. A divorce attorney? Not for themselves. They were asking about annulment procedures for their daughter's marriage. The words hung in the air like smoke. I'd known Richard and Catherine disapproved of me. I'd endured 24 years of their polite condescension, their subtle suggestions that Beth had married beneath her station. But this was different. This was active planning. They're going to try to buy me out, I said quietly. That would be my assessment, James agreed. Offer you money to walk away, appeal to your supposed financial desperation, make it look like generosity. I almost laughed. Almost. How much do you think they'll offer? James shrugged. Based on what they probably think you're worth, maybe 300,000, $500,000 if they're feeling generous. I thought about the $14.96 billion in Beacon Capital. I thought about the $800,000 my grandfather had left me in 1997 with a note that said, "Use it to build something real, not something impressive." I thought about Beth, painting in our cramped apartment, happy with our life because she thought we were building something based on love, not money. And I thought about my daughter Sarah, who was 21 now, who'd spent the last 3 years growing colder and more distant, who called her grandparents more than she called us. I want you there on standby Friday night, I said. I'll call you when the moment comes. James nodded. And then? And then they're going to learn something they should have known 24 years ago. You can't buy what was never for sale. That evening, my phone rang while Beth was in the shower. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. I answered on the second ring. Hi, honey. There was a pause, that particular silence that had grown between us over the past few years. Hey, Dad. Just wanted to let you know I'll be at Grandma and Grandpa's on Friday, too. Not, can I come to dinner? Not, are you and Mom going? Just a statement of fact. She'd be there, at her grandparents' house, where she spent more time than she'd spent in our Cambridge apartment in the past 2 years. Your mom will be happy to see you, I said carefully. Another pause. How's work? She asked, and I could hear the dismissiveness in her voice, that tone she'd learned from her grandfather. How's your little consulting business? Fine, I said. How's school? Actually, I wanted to tell you, Grandpa is giving me a summer internship in the strategy division at Whitmore Maritime. Real corporate work, you know? Strategic planning, logistics integration. It's a pretty big deal. That's great, Sarah. I kept my voice neutral, but something twisted in my chest. The strategy division reported directly to Richard. Sarah would spend the summer learning to see the company the way her grandfather saw it, as his creation, his legacy, his empire. She'd never know that every major decision in the past 15 years had been funded by money from Beacon Capital. Money from me. Mom's really proud of you, I added. Yeah. Another pause. Listen, Dad, I should go. See you Friday. She hung up before I could say goodbye. Beth emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in her robe, toweling her hair. Was that Sarah? She's going to be at dinner Friday. Beth's face lit up, then clouded with concern. That's good, right? We haven't seen her in weeks. It's good, I said, pulling her close. But I was thinking about the way Sarah had said real corporate work, the way she'd emphasized strategic planning, as if my 29 years in logistics consulting, building supply chain solutions for companies across New England, was somehow less real, less strategic. Richard and Catherine had been working on her, slowly, carefully, teaching her to measure worth in corner offices and summer internships and the size of one's house, teaching her that her father, who drove a Honda and lived in Cambridge, was something to be quietly embarrassed about. Friday would tell me if I'd lost her completely. Wednesday afternoon, I met an old friend from MIT for lunch at a cafe near campus. Robert had gone into venture capital, made his money in tech startups, and still liked to keep his finger on the pulse of Boston business. So, he said over sandwiches, you hear about Whitmore Maritime? I kept my expression neutral. What about them? Word is they're having cash flow problems. Nothing public yet, but Vincent Hayes has been making the rounds looking for investors. Robert leaned forward. Between you and me, I heard they turned down a buyout offer from Meridian Logistics last year. Probably should have taken it. Why would they have cash flow problems? I asked. Their roots are solid. Robert shrugged. That's the question, isn't it? On paper, they should be printing money. East Coast shipping is booming, but something's not adding up. Hayes has been vague about it, which makes people nervous. I filed this information away. I knew exactly why the numbers weren't adding up. Hayes had been using company resources to cover his gambling debts, creating a slow leak that Richard probably attributed to market conditions or operational costs. You still doing that consulting thing? Robert asked, changing the subject. Still doing it, I confirmed. Ever think about going bigger? I mean, you've got the brain for it. You could probably run a firm, take on major corporate clients. I like what I do, I said simply. It gives me time for what matters. Robert shook his head with a smile. That's always been you, David. Content with enough. Most guys with your intelligence would want more. I have more, I thought. I have $14.96 billion. I just don't need everyone to know it. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. James Patterson's name appeared on the screen. We have a problem, he said without preamble. I stepped into my home office, really just a converted closet with a desk and a laptop, and closed the door. Tell me. Hayes's loan comes due Monday. But here's the thing. He can't pay it. He's tapped out every resource he has, and Redstone knows it. So they're going to seize his shares. More than that. They've already been in contact with other major shareholders. They're preparing a hostile takeover bid. They want to acquire enough shares to force a sale of the entire company. I sat down heavily. They've contacted Beacon Capital? Not yet. But they will, probably within days. And David, if they get control, they're going to liquidate. Sell off the routes, the contracts, everything. 1,500 employees will lose their jobs. The Whitmore name will disappear. I thought about Richard, who'd spent 40 years building that company. I thought about the young man I'd seen in 1997, drowning in debt from the Asian financial crisis, too proud to declare bankruptcy but desperate enough to accept anonymous capital from a newly formed investment firm. Here's what I want you to do, I said. Contact Redstone. Tell them Beacon Capital wants to purchase Hayes's debt. Purchase the debt? James sounded surprised. David, that's $50 million. Offer them $35 million. They'll take it. It's a guaranteed return rather than a messy seizure and liquidation. And once we own the debt, we control Hayes's timeline. There was a long pause. You're going to save Vincent Hayes after what he's done? I'm going to save the company, I corrected. And I'm going to make sure Richard understands exactly who's been protecting him all these years. And the dinner Friday night? That's when everything changes, I said. Be ready for my call. Friday arrived cold and gray, the kind of November day that makes Boston feel unforgiving. Beth moved through our apartment with nervous energy, changing clothes twice, asking questions I couldn't fully answer. Why do you think they want this dinner? She asked for the third time. I was knotting my tie in the bathroom mirror, one of 3 ties I owned, all purchased at the same department store sale 7 years ago. I think they want to talk about family. They never want to talk about family unless someone's dying or getting divorced. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress that she'd owned since our wedding. David, promise me you won't let them bully you. Whatever they say about your work, our apartment, any of it, promise me you'll just let it roll off. I turned to face her. This woman who'd chosen me over the life her parents wanted for her, who'd never once complained about our modest lifestyle, who'd spent 24 years believing I was exactly what I appeared to be. I promise, I said, that by the end of tonight, they'll see exactly who I am. She squeezed my hand, trusting me the way she'd always trusted me. That trust was about to be tested in ways neither of us could predict. The drive to Wellesley took 30 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another country. Cambridge slipped past the windows, our neighborhood of professors and artists, grad students and working families, everyone crammed into 100-year-old buildings with radiators that clanked and floors that creaked, comfortable, diverse, real. Then we crossed into Wellesley, and the world changed. The streets widened, the houses grew larger, set back behind stone walls and gates that suggested privacy was the highest form of wealth. Even in November, the lawns looked perfect, maintained by landscapers who probably earned more than I supposedly made in a year. Beth's hand found mine on the center console. Every time I come back here, she said softly, I remember why I left. The Whitmore estate sat on 5 acres at the end of a private road. The house was a Georgian colonial, all symmetry and columns, the kind of architecture that announced its importance to anyone who passed by. Lights glowed in every window, making it look less like a home and more like a museum after dark. I pulled the Honda into the circular driveway, between Richard's Mercedes and a car I didn't recognize, probably Sarah's, borrowed from her grandparents because her own car was too old to bring to Wellesley. Before I could turn off the engine, the front door opened. Not Richard or Catherine, but Margaret, the housekeeper who'd worked for the Whitmores for 30 years. She stood in the doorway in her uniform, and something about the formality of it sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a transaction. They're really doing this, Beth whispered. I squeezed her hand. Let them. We walked to the door together. Margaret greeted us with professional courtesy, taking our coats without quite meeting my eyes. Then Richard appeared in the foyer, 73 years old and still carrying himself like the CEO he was, like a man who'd built empires and expected deference. David. His handshake was designed to dominate, gripped too firm, held too long. Beth, sweetheart. Catherine emerged from the living room, elegant in pearls and a silk blouse that probably cost more than our monthly rent. She embraced Beth, then turned to me with an air kiss that landed somewhere near my cheek without making actual contact. So good of you to come, she said in a tone that suggested it was anything but good. Mom, Dad, they're here. Sarah's voice came from deeper in the house, casual, bored. We found her in the living room, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up as we entered. 21 years old, Harvard Business School junior, and increasingly a stranger. She'd grown up in our Cambridge apartment, But somewhere in the past few years, she'd decided that wasn't good enough. "Hi, honey," Beth said softly, hopefully. Sarah looked up for half a second. "Hi, Mom. Hey, Dad." Dad. Said like she was acknowledging a stranger at a business meeting. I remembered her at 7, asking me why we didn't have a big house like Grandma and Grandpa. I'd tried to explain about values, about building a life based on what mattered rather than what impressed. She'd nodded, but even then, I could see she didn't understand, or didn't want to. "Shall we?" Richard gestured toward the dining room. The table was set for 5 with china that probably cost more per plate than I supposedly earned in a week. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier. The seating arrangement told me everything. Richard at the head, Catherine to his right, Sarah beside her grandmother, Beth and I across from them, physically separated, outnumbered, isolated. We sat. Margaret appeared with the first course, some kind of French onion soup in delicate bowls, and as she served it, I could feel them all watching me, waiting, measuring. The trap was set. They just had no idea who they were trying to catch. The first course came and went with the kind of forced pleasantries that precede an execution. Richard asked about my work with the careful condescension of a man humoring a child's hobby. "Still doing the consulting thing?" he asked, cutting his soup with the edge of his spoon. "Logistics, wasn't it?" "Supply chain optimization," I said. "For mid-sized regional companies." "Ah." He nodded as if I'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. "Nothing too complex, then. The real strategic work happens at scale, corporate level. My team handles billion-dollar route networks, international shipping contracts." He paused. "Of course, that takes a certain kind of vision. Not everyone can see the big picture." Across the table, Sarah looked up from her phone long enough to add, "Grandfather's been teaching me about strategic planning. It's fascinating how complex it gets at the enterprise level." Beth's hand found mine under the table, a silent apology for what her family was doing. But I just nodded and said, "Sounds ambitious." The disappointment on Richard's face was almost comical. He'd wanted engagement, maybe argument, something he could use to prove I was out of my depth. Instead, I gave him nothing. Catherine picked up the thread as Margaret cleared the soup bowls. "Beth, darling, did I mention I ran into Thomas Bradford at the club last week?" Beth's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I recognized the name. Old money, Harvard legacy, the kind of man Richard and Catherine had probably imagined their daughter marrying. "Thomas is doing remarkably well," Catherine continued, her voice light and casual in the way that precedes a knife thrust. "Just made partner at Wellington and Cross, bought a place in Beacon Hill, absolutely stunning property. 4 bedrooms, original crown molding, views of the common." "I'm happy with my life, Mother," Beth said quietly. "Of course you are, sweetheart." Catherine's smile could have cut glass. "I'm just saying it's interesting how life turns out, isn't it? The choices we make when we're young, the paths we choose." The main course arrived, some kind of fish that probably cost more per ounce than we spent on groceries in a week. Richard attacked it with surgical precision, and I knew the real assault was about to begin. "We just finalized the new Atlantic expansion route," he announced, as if we'd all been waiting breathlessly for this news. 10-year project, $2 billion in investment. Takes real vision to see opportunities like that, real understanding of market dynamics and capital allocation. I approved that funding, I thought, watching him perform. 18 months ago, when Beacon Capital injected $450 million. You're lecturing me about a project I greenlit. But I just said, "Sounds like a major undertaking." Richard leaned back, warming to his subject. "The shipping industry is changing, David. Companies that can't adapt, that don't have the resources to make bold moves, they get left behind. It's Darwinian, really. Only the strongest survive." "Is that what you think?" I asked mildly. "That it's about strength?" "Of course. Strength, vision, capital. Without those 3 things, you're just treading water. Eventually, you drown." Beth set down her fork. "Dad, is there a point to this?" But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, and I could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the certainty that he'd already won whatever game he thought we were playing. Across the table, Sarah finally put down her phone. "Grandfather's given me real responsibilities," she said, and I couldn't tell if she was talking to me or through me. "I'm coordinating with the logistics team on the new terminal integration. Real work, strategic work." "That's wonderful, honey," Beth said, trying to catch our daughter's eye. But Sarah was staring at me now, really looking at me for the first time all evening. "Some of us are actually building careers, not just consulting." She said the word like it was something distasteful. "Sarah." Beth's voice had an edge I recognized, the one that came out when she was defending me for the 1,000th time in 24 years. "What? I'm just being honest." Sarah turned to her mother, and something in her expression made my chest tighten. "Mom, don't you ever wonder? Don't you ever think about what life would be like if you'd made different choices?" The silence that followed was absolute. "That's your father you're talking about," Beth said, her voice shaking. Sarah shrugged, actually shrugged, as if she'd commented on the weather instead of suggesting her mother's entire marriage was a mistake. "I'm just saying, you could have had anything, anyone. And instead..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I stayed perfectly still, which seemed to infuriate them more than any response I could have given. They wanted me to react, to defend myself, to prove I cared what they thought. But I'd spent 24 years learning to read this family, and tonight wasn't about conversation. It was about positioning. They were circling, testing, preparing for something. Dessert came and went, some elaborate creation involving chocolate and gold leaf that probably took hours to prepare. Margaret cleared the plates with practiced efficiency, and for a moment there was silence, the kind that feels like held breath. Then Richard cleared his throat and reached beneath his chair. When his hand emerged, it held a leather folder that would change everything. The leather folder landed on the table between wine glasses and crystal with a soft thud that somehow silenced the room more effectively than a gunshot. Richard slid it toward me with the confidence of a man who'd closed 1,000 deals, who'd never failed to get what he wanted through the careful application of money and pressure. "David," he said, leaning back in his chair like a judge about to deliver a verdict, "I'll be direct. You married above your station. That's not an insult. It's a fact. Beth could have had anyone. She could have had Thomas Bradford, or any number of men who could have given her the life she deserved." Beth stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "This is insane. You can't—" "Margot, sit down." Richard's voice carried decades of command, of being obeyed without question. "The adults are talking." "I'm 49 years old, Dad," Beth said, her voice breaking. "And my husband is right here while you're—" But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were fixed on me as he opened the leather folder with deliberate precision. Inside, stapled with $500 precision, lay an annulment agreement. Clipped to the front was a check. I leaned forward to read the amount. $350,000. "We tried to accept this marriage," Richard continued, as if Beth hadn't spoken. "For 24 years we tried, but Catherine and I can't watch our daughter struggle financially because of pride, yours or hers." Catherine leaned forward, her expression almost gentle. Almost. "David, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help everyone. Beth deserves security, stability, a life commensurate with her background and education." "That check," Richard said, tapping it with one manicured finger, "is more than you'd make in 10 years as a consultant. It's a generous offer, more than generous. Sign the annulment papers, take the money, and move on. You'll be better off. Beth will be better off. Everyone will be better off." The silence pressed against my ears like water pressure. I could hear Beth crying softly, could feel the weight of Sarah's gaze, could sense Catherine and Richard's certainty that they'd already won. "David," Richard said, his voice almost kind now, "be reasonable. You've had a good run, 24 years with a woman who is frankly out of your league. No one can fault you for that. But it's time to be practical. Take the money, start over, find someone more suitable to your circumstances." Beth turned toward our daughter, disbelief warring with desperate hope. "Sarah, you're not going to say anything?" Sarah met her mother's eyes. Something flickered there, doubt maybe, or guilt, but then she looked at me, and her expression hardened. "Mom," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Grandmother's right. You deserve better." "Sarah," Beth's voice cracked. "Dad, be honest." Sarah's eyes locked with mine. "You're holding Mom back. You've always held her back. You live in that tiny apartment. You drive that embarrassing car. Everyone knows you're not good enough for her." She said it like a simple truth, like she was pointing out that the sky was blue or water was wet. No malice, just fact. "Take the money and go," she added, turning back to her grandmother. "You'd be doing everyone a favor." Beth broke then, crying the way people do when something inside finally shatters. "That's your father. How can you—" "Mom." Sarah's voice was almost gentle now. "You could be with someone like Thomas Bradford, someone with a real future, someone who wouldn't make you choose between family and marriage, someone who wouldn't embarrass you at every turn." I watched my daughter measure my worth and discard me, and it hurt more than anything her grandparents had said. I'd loved Beth without conditions through lean years and quiet victories, believing patience would teach our daughter what mattered. I'd swallowed every slight from her parents, thinking time would soften them. But they'd been working on Sarah for years, teaching her that worth was measured in square footage and stock portfolios, that love was a transaction that required proper capital investment. And I'd let them do it, believing that living our values would speak louder than their words. I'd been wrong. "Well?" Richard prompted. "I assume you'll want time to think about it, perhaps consult with—" "No," I said quietly. I picked up the check and examined it, letting them believe I was tempted, letting them see what they wanted to see. Richard smiled. "I knew you'd be reasonable." I set the check down carefully, then I took out my phone. "Before I respond," I said, "I need to make a quick call." Richard frowned. "What does your attorney have to do with this?" "David, the offer isn't negotiable. It's—" "Not my attorney," I interrupted. I dialed James Patterson's number and put the phone on speaker, placing it in the center of the table beside the leather folder and the 350-hour check. The line rang twice. Then, "David, I've been expecting your call." "James," I said calmly, "I'm having dinner with the Whitmore family. Could you please explain the current ownership structure of Whitmore Maritime and Logistics?" "Of course," James replied without pause, his voice crisp and professional through the speaker. Richard leaned forward. "What is this supposed to—" But James was already speaking. "Whitmore Maritime and Logistics Corporation has 100 million shares outstanding. The largest shareholder is Beacon Capital Partners, LLC, which owns 44 million shares, representing 44% of the company." The room went very still. "The second largest shareholder," James continued, "is Richard Whitmore personally, holding 19 million shares or 19%. The third largest shareholder is Vincent Hayes, CFO, with 12 million shares or 12%. The remaining 25% is divided among institutional and private investors." Sarah's phone slipped from her hand and clattered on the table. Catherine's wineglass tipped, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Richard stared at the phone as if it were speaking a foreign language. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Beacon Capital is— I thought it was an institutional investor, a pension fund or—" "James," I said, my voice steady, "who owns Beacon Capital Partners?" "Beacon Capital Partners, LLC was established in 1997 and is wholly owned by David William Morrison." James paused, letting it sink in. "At today's closing price of $340 per share, the Whitmore Maritime position is valued at approximately $14.96 billion. The silence was total, complete, as if the world had stopped spinning. "That's impossible," Richard said again, but his voice had lost all its certainty. I stood slowly, walked around the table until I faced him directly. "Is it? 27 years ago, your company was collapsing. The Asian financial crisis destroyed your credit. Your roots were profitable, but you'd over-leveraged during the expansion. No bank would touch you. You were 3 months from bankruptcy. Richard tried to speak and failed. I was 27 years old, I continued. I'd just inherited $800,000 from my grandfather. I spent 6 months studying your business. Your fundamentals were strong. You just needed capital. So I bought in quietly, through entities you never thought to question, because the money came when you needed it most. I could see Beth staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Within 3 years, I owned 15%, I said. When I met Beth at that art gallery opening, I owned 31%. By our wedding, 42%. Today, 44%. Every expansion you credit to your leadership, I continued, my voice level. The Atlantic routes, the port modernization, the logistics software that saved you in 2015, all funded with my capital. Every board vote that mattered, I controlled. Every strategic decision, I approved. I let the words settle like snow. You work for me, Richard. You just didn't know it. Then I turned to Sarah. She sat frozen, tears gathering in her eyes but not yet falling. Sarah, I said gently, I wanted to know something. I wanted to know if my daughter valued character or wealth, if you loved me for who I am, or if you'd been taught to love only what people appear to have. Dad, her voice was barely a whisper. Tonight, I have my answer, I said. Your internship at Whitmore Maritime is terminated, effective immediately. Perhaps it's time you learned what a real career requires, one you build yourself without a family name opening doors. Dad, I didn't know. Would it have mattered? I asked. The silence gave me my answer. I picked up the torn pieces of the check so they could see them. I never wanted your money, Richard. I wanted family. I wanted to love your daughter without being measured against bank statements and property values, but you only saw someone you believed was beneath you. I dropped the pieces on the table. I've called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The agenda is simple: a vote on the CEO position. You'll be removed and professional management will be installed. This is my company, Richard shouted, finding his voice at last. I built it. No, I said quietly. You drove it to the edge of bankruptcy. I saved it while you sat here trying to buy me away from your daughter. I turned to Beth. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but when I held out my hand, she took it without hesitation. We have a long drive home, I said softly. Behind us, the Whitmore family sat amid the ruins of everything they'd believed, and for the first time in 24 years, they finally saw me clearly. But as we walked toward the door, James's voice came through the phone speaker one more time. David, there's one more item we should discuss. I stopped, Beth's hand in mine. The matter of Vincent Hayes's debt to Redstone Capital. As you requested, I completed the acquisition yesterday. Beacon Capital now holds Mr. Hayes's $50 million obligation. The payment deadline is Monday, 9 a.m. Richard's face went white. Vincent? What debt? What is he talking about? I turned back to face them. Your trusted CFO, your friend of 30 years, has been gambling. Online poker, sports betting. He's lost approximately $8 million over the past 2 years. Last month, he borrowed $50 million from Redstone Capital using his shares as collateral. The loan comes due Monday. That's not possible, Richard breathed. Vincent wouldn't. Redstone was planning a hostile takeover, I continued. They wanted to seize Hayes's shares, approach me as Beacon Capital, and consolidate enough ownership to force a sale of the entire company. They would have liquidated everything, sold it for parts. 1,500 employees would have lost their jobs. I let that sink in. Yesterday, I bought Hayes's debt from Redstone for $35 million, which means Vincent now owes me $50 million, and I control whether he pays it back or loses everything. Catherine's hand went to her throat. Sarah had gone completely still. Monday, I said, we're going to have a very different kind of family meeting, one where everyone finally understands how this company has actually been running for the past 27 years. I looked at each of them in turn, Richard, Catherine, Sarah. Then my eyes settled on Beth. Ready to go home? I asked. She nodded, squeezing my hand. We walked out of the Whitmore estate together, leaving behind 3 people who'd just learned that the man they'd spent 24 years dismissing had been holding their entire world in his hands all along. The drive back to Cambridge was silent for 20 minutes. Beth stared out the window, tears tracking down her cheeks. Finally, she spoke. $14.96 billion. I kept my eyes on the road. Yes. 24 years, David. Every morning I budgeted for groceries, worried about bills, and you had almost $15 billion. I pulled into a parking lot near Fresh Pond. The engine ticked as it cooled. When I met you, I said slowly, you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Not just physically, but the way you talked about creating something meaningful instead of impressive. Your parents saw inadequacy when they looked at me. If I'd told you about the money, everything would have changed. You didn't trust me, she said. I didn't trust the situation. Your parents would have said I was after the company, and you might have wondered late at night if I loved you or loved access to Whitmore Maritime. Beth was quiet for a long moment. And Sarah? The name hung between us like an accusation. I thought if I raised her right, if she saw how we lived, she'd understand what mattered. My voice broke. I was wrong. Beth reached for my hand. I'm angry, so angry I can barely breathe, but I understand why you did it, and God help me, you were probably right. She leaned across the console and kissed me, salt from tears mixing with the kiss. But no more secrets, and we're going to fix what's broken with our daughter, even if it takes years. Deal, I whispered. Monday morning, the Whitmore Maritime boardroom was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate. At 9 a.m., I sat at the conference table surrounded by board members hastily summoned for an emergency meeting. Richard arrived last, looking like he'd aged 10 years. Vincent Hayes followed, pale and avoiding everyone's eyes. James Patterson distributed packets. As you know, Beacon Capital holds 44% of Whitmore Maritime. Mr. Morrison is here as principal owner. For 20 minutes, James laid it out. Vincent's gambling, the unauthorized loan, the near miss with Redstone Capital, the fact that Beacon Capital had funded every major expansion for 27 years. When he finished, independent director Patricia Chen spoke. Mr. Morrison, why reveal yourself now? Because the company I invested in was about to be destroyed, I said simply. Not by market forces, but by complacency. It was time. And your relationship to Mr. Whitmore? He's my father-in-law. I married his daughter 24 years ago. The room erupted in murmurs. I'd like to propose a restructuring, I continued. Richard remains as CEO, but we bring in Thomas Bradford as co-CEO for 1 year. Then Richard transitions to chairman emeritus. Patricia nodded. And Mr. Hayes? I turned to Vincent, who looked like a man awaiting execution. Vincent stays as CFO with quarterly external audits. And Vincent, I met his eyes. You have 5 years to repay the $50 million at 2% interest. Structured payments you can actually make. Vincent's head snapped up. Why would you? 27 years ago, my grandfather had gambling debt. A man could have destroyed him. Instead, he got a chance to make it right. My grandfather spent his life repaying that debt, then built the inheritance he left me. I paused. I'm giving you what someone once gave him. Don't waste it. Vincent put his face in his hands and wept. The vote passed unanimously. As the meeting adjourned, Richard approached me. You could have destroyed me, he said quietly. You're Beth's father, I replied. Somewhere under all that arrogance, I'd like to believe there's a man who actually loves his daughter. I do. His voice was rough. I just didn't understand. Then learn, I said. Starting now. The first month was hard. Beth and I talked for hours, sometimes arguing, sometimes crying, working through 24 years of choices that couldn't be undone. Sarah didn't call. By February, Beth had launched the Morrison Whitmore Foundation for first-generation college students. $50 million from me, $5 million from Richard and Catherine, their first contribution to something Beth actually cared about. "This is what I should have been doing all along," Beth said, touring the foundation's new Cambridge office, "opening doors for kids who don't have the connections." By March, Whitmore Maritime stock had climbed 35%. Thomas Bradford was exactly what the company needed. Richard, surprisingly, seemed relieved to share the burden. Then, 6 weeks after that terrible Friday, my phone rang. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was small. "Can we talk?" We met at a coffee shop near Harvard. Sarah looked different, thinner, tired, wearing jeans instead of business casual. "I got a job, junior analyst at a logistics startup in Austin. I start in 2 weeks." "That's great, honey. It's grunt work, data analysis, spreadsheets, real entry-level work." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. The things I said, I don't know who that person was." "You were 21, I said gently. "Your grandparents spent years teaching you to measure worth in bank accounts. That's not entirely your fault." "But I hurt Mom." "Yes, and rebuilding that trust will take time." Sarah nodded. "The job in Austin, I didn't use the Whitmore name or yours, just my resume and 3 interviews." "Good. That's exactly right." When we parted, I hugged her tightly. "I'm proud of you. I love you, Dad. I'm going to prove I learned something." "I know you will." 7 months after everything changed, we gathered for dinner again, but this time in our Cambridge apartment. Richard and Catherine arrived first. Over the past months, they'd started coming every 2 weeks. Catherine looked around our small space with something like wonder. "You really chose this," she said. "It wasn't about money." "I wanted Beth," I said. The life came with her. Richard had sold his Mercedes for a Toyota. Catherine volunteered 15 hours weekly at the foundation. Slowly, painfully, they were becoming the parents Beth deserved. The doorbell rang. Beth answered, and Sarah stood there, home from Austin for the first time since taking the job. She looked healthier, more confident, wearing casual clothes that came from earning a paycheck. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said. Beth pulled her into a fierce hug. "Hi, baby." We crowded around our small table, 6 people in a space not quite big enough. It wasn't elegant, but it was real. "I got promoted," Sarah announced. "Junior to mid-level analyst, 17% raise." "That's wonderful," Beth said, pride in her voice. "I earned it. 3 months of 12-hour days and a presentation that showed exceptional analytical rigor." Richard raised his glass. "To Sarah and to honest work." Later, Richard pulled me aside. "David, I've been thinking about what you said, about really loving Beth. I do love her. But I loved my idea of what her life should be more than what she actually wanted. That's not real love, is it?" "No," I agreed. I'm 74. It took me this long to figure out that the house, the cars, the memberships, none of it means anything if you lose your family." He met my eyes. "Thank you for not destroying me, for giving me a chance to learn while I still have time." "You're Beth's father," I said. "That's worth more than you know." That night, Beth and I stood on our balcony overlooking Cambridge. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Letting them treat you that way for so long?" "Never. Because now I know your parents love you more than their pride. You chose me for who I am. And I proved that the most powerful people in any room are usually the ones nobody notices." She kissed me, the city glowing below. Money was a tool. Character was a foundation. But love, real love that survived secrets and anger in 24 years, that was the only currency that truly appreciated. We had almost lost everything, and in nearly losing it, we'd found something stronger. 1 year later, Whitmore Maritime went public. The IPO valued the company at $50 billion. I sold 6%, $3 billion, into the Morrison Whitmore Foundation's endowment, 500 scholarships awarded, kids with intelligence and drive but not connections or capital. Beth ran it with passion, and watching her changed my understanding of what wealth could do. Sarah came home for Thanksgiving, promoted again to senior analyst. She brought her boyfriend, a software engineer who drove a Honda and lived in a studio apartment. I saw in her eyes that she finally understood. Richard retired at 75. Thomas Bradford became CEO. Richard and Catherine downsized to Newton, closer to the foundation where Catherine volunteered 4 days a week. And I kept consulting, kept my Honda Accord, kept our apartment, though we did replace the kitchen table. The money was there for causes that mattered, for people we loved. But it didn't define us. My name is David Morrison. This is proof that character matters more than money, that love matters more than status, and that the greatest victories are the ones nobody sees coming. Stay humble, know your worth, and never let anyone make you feel small simply because they cannot see how powerful you truly are.